Welcome back, everyone. This is Trek Wars at OSU, Oregon State University. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco. I'm a professor of philosophy at Oregon State University, and I'm the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine a future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire to the fullest extent possible. And our Trek Wars at OSU is an attempt to try to examine some of the biggest science fiction franchises, including Star Trek and Star Wars, for lessons, thoughts, reflections about how to think about our contemporary cultural, social, political, and economic situations. And today, I have a very special guest with me to try to think about the most recent Star Trek series, Picard, and to answer the question whether or not Star Trek Picard is really, truly Star Trek. Is it faithful to the Star Trek universe, to Star Trek philosophy? And so my guest today is a real dear colleague. She is Dr. Christina Allaback from the Umpqua Community College here in Roseburg, Oregon. She's a professor of theater there. She is also the founder of Trek Theater, which, for those of you who don't know about Trek Theater and about the Star Trek phenomenon in Oregon in general, in the past, say, 10 years or so, there have been at least two really important theater troupes who have done live action performances of Star Trek episodes in Portland and then in Eugene with Trek Theater. And Christina Allaback was one of the founders of Trek Theater in Eugene. And she was she's formerly now the artistic director of the program, but for several years would do live performances of Star Trek and episodes and other science fiction episodes in the Willamette Valley. And so I'm very excited to have her here to talk with me about Star Trek Picard. And we're going to do this in sort of a kind of semi-debate format. I am going to be arguing that Star Trek Picard is truly faithful to the Star Trek world. That's why I'm sitting here in my Star Trek Picard era uniform. This is from the era of the synth attack on the Utopia Planitia shipyards on Mars. And I'm also in the study at Chateau Picard. I'm here joined by Christina Allaback. And so let me turn this over to you, Christina. Thank you for being here and agreeing to do this discussion with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. All right.
Oh, so tell us a little bit about what you think about what's going on with Picard.
Picard, all right. So, yeah, as a theater person and a Trekkie, I just didn't like it. I mean, I saw it as an adequate science fiction show, but I feel like it has some problems. As a Trekkie, I see problems as a Trekkie, but also as a theater person. And with the script, I also felt that there were some problems too. So I'll talk a little bit about this.
Which is why you decided to go old school.
Yeah, I got my old
Trek.
School stuff on.
Right,
Yeah.
New generation with the old Enterprise D bridge.
Yeah, Next Gen is my favorite Star Trek, right? So I should also say that I'm coming from a deep love of Star Trek The Next Generation in my criticisms of Star Trek Picard. So
cool.
Okay.
Well, go ahead. Why don't you tell us what you think the problems are with Picard?
All right. So let's see. Oh, am I doing this right? Yes. Okay, there we go. All right. So my first issue with Picard is that, yeah, it's okay. I feel like Star Trek Picard's Picard isn't Picard. And this is, it's many years later, right? But the issue is his name is in the title, but I feel like he's not the protagonist of the story. Um, I feel like protagonist and antagonist in this show is very messy for me. And I feel like Soji is really the protagonist. She's the one whose story I follow. She's the one who has an arc. She's the one who's making changes and making discoveries. So for me, I went through it when I first watched it. I was just sort of like, does Picard need to be there? I mean, in some small ways he does, but I feel like there's other stories to be told. This Picard is dissimilar to the Picard that we already know. He sort of isn't a strong leader anymore. He gets people are sort of always on his case about things. I feel like he, doesn't act like the captain and the diplomat, he usually is. He gives great little speeches every once in a while. And I'm like, yes, there's Picard. But obviously he must have changed a lot. So for me, I'm more interested in that story. Like, how did he change like this? What's going on? I mean, it probably has stuff to do with the synth attacks and the Romulan refugee crisis, but I'm sort of like, well, I want to really know that story. So I feel like he's uncharacteristically Picard. He also, I kind of feel like his relationship with Data wasn't really that strong in Next Generation. Like he was, he was close to Crusher and he was close to Riker. And otherwise, we know from lots of episodes that he is a private man. They say over and over in Cupid, he's a private man. And Geordi was Data's best friend. We know that from, many episodes, Data's Day being one. And then the last moment of the show, he sits down and plays poker with his crew. And this is like a huge deal because he's a private man. He doesn't mix, socially with his crew. So for me, I was sort of like, well, okay, so he keeps referring to Data as a very dear friend. And, I felt it was kind of odd from me. Also, he likes chill. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, can I jump in and say something?
Yeah, jump in, please.
Yeah, I'll try not to do this too much, but I wanted to say that I agree with you on this point about the relationship with Data as it's expressed in Picard. I mean, of course, there's going to be a lot of spoilers here, so if you haven't watched Picard yet, we're going to be jumping around all over the place with this, but I think that it was a little odd for me to see, especially with the choice that Data makes at the end of the series, in which, he decides to essentially commit suicide, or to have his consciousness erased from the databanks, so to speak, right? No pun intended. But Data says that he wants Picard to be there with him, and so you see Picard there, with Data as he starts to pass away, and Picard, of course, is in. I thought it was significant that it was in his Next Generation uniform.
Yeah.
Right. So it's this kind of vision, so that for Data, right, the image that he has of Picard is of the sort of captain of, almost 20, 30 years before. So that's significant. But I was thinking about this. I mean, would Data have chosen Picard to be the person with him at his death? Why not LaForge?
Right. Yeah.
As you point
absolutely.
out, that was a closer relationship, it seemed. So it seemed that, it seemed odd, because it seemed like this is the death as Picard would have seen it, rather than the death that Data would have chosen for himself.
Yeah.
So I thought that I want to concede that this point seemed a little strange even to me.
All right, cool. Yeah. The other thing is that he likes children, which I always found to be a very funny point in Next Generation, because it's a point of comedy, right? It's like, oh, there's children. The captain doesn't like children. He wants children off the bridge. And then he has this amazing relationship with this young child. And I feel it isn't really explained why he changes his decision mind about kids, right? Like for me, I feel the story that I would much rather see is the story of Picard changing from TNG Picard to Star Trek Picard. Right? For me, that's a more interesting story. And there's lots of sort of other things that were uncharacteristic, like or there's just everyone's going on about, oh, get yourself in trouble again, and Raffi says something about all, massive ego and all id, and I'm sort of like, wait a second, like Picard isn't the impulsive one. That was Kirk, right? That was why it was really great after TOS, where we had a very impulsive captain, to have a very thoughtful, introspective, like concerned, you know, diplomat as a captain, as opposed to a Kirk, right? So when everyone's talking about him always being in trouble and he's all id, I'm like, that dude, that's the opposite. He's not all id. The idea that he goes and picks a fight at a Romulans only bar or restaurant was very uncharacteristic to me. Also because he's very, he's an old man. Like, what are you doing? I felt that scene was really just an excuse to get like a really awesome action scene happening, right? But he talks about how he respects other cultures all the time in TNG, and all the stuff, and then to show up on the Romulan planet and rip off the Romulan only sign and then go into their space, I felt was kind of uncharacteristic. And also him dressing up like a French guy for a heist. I know Patrick Stewart had a great time with that, I could tell, but it just didn't seem very Picard-esque to me. There's lots of things, lots of things I felt. I won't go into everything because I have notes and notes and notes. But there are moments where I'm just like, that doesn't seem like Picard. And for me, I don't feel that's the story that I want to know.
Right.
In theater, we call it the circle of expectations. This is an improvisational, theatrical term, the circle of expectations. But I use it when talking about plays, play direction, and playwriting. And in this case, screenwriting, right? This is from Keith Johnstone. And we as an audience have a circle of expectations, right? And this circle, we want things to happen within this circle. And, when things hit in the center, we're like, yes. And things start hitting the edges of the circle, we're like, all right, this is still cool. But when things happen outside the circle, we get kind of confused, we disconnect, we don't engage with the story. And that's sort of what I felt was going on with Picard, was that I have these circles of expectations about who Captain Picard is, or who, say, 7 of 9 is, or who Data is. And so they're shooting outside of the circle of expectations for me. And then I was getting disconnected. And I found myself actually falling asleep a lot during my first and my second viewing of the show, because I was disconnected and unengaged. So that's the circle of expectations. Oh, I have to. All right. So the other thing that I didn't like about Star Trek Picard is that it's kind of retelling stories that have already been told in TNG. Its main theme is it's playing on our anxieties with artificial intelligence, which is a theme I love, right? I love robots, I love androids, I love artificial intelligence. These are stories that I love, but I kept on thinking that the same themes were dealt with a lot better and more efficiently in TNG, where they handled it in like a little half-hour, 45-minute episode. It was really concise, really good writing. And I feel like it's different when you have this whole longer sort of, a serial style of television. It's a little different. I felt like a lot of the, same sort of things happened, not just in TNG, but in sci-fi generally. Like, the question, will AI help us or ultimately destroy us? What constitutes a sentient life form? The pending apocalypse is very popular. And like the android that goes nuts when she finds out she's, not human. Like, these are things that I see like over and over and over again. And I really just wanted Star Trek Picard to just deal with something else, I guess, that TNG didn't. However, TNG did cover like a lot of stuff. So that's hard to do. But I felt like, the writing, for me, it was really in the writing that I felt could have been improved. All right, next, it focuses on spectacle. And for me, hold on, let me me go through here. All right. So for me, going way, way back to the first theatrical theorist, Aristotle, he went to lots of plays and came up with this. He said, hey, look, all plays have these things in common: plot, character, thought, theme, diction, music, spectacle. And those are in the order of importance. Plot, he says, is the most important, then character, and then the thought, theme, the diction, which is the language, or the poetry in his case. All plays were in poetry back then. Music, and then spectacle. He really believed that spectacle was the least important, because if you have all this beautiful stuff to look at, but not a good plot and not good characters, it just isn't going to be a good play. And we see this all the time with big budget movies and big budget Broadway musicals. Star Trek, Turn Off the Dark comes to mind. So for where I feel spectacle being, great in Picard, it was lovely. It was beautiful to look at. The direction was good. The production design was fantastic. And I thought, honestly, the best part of, I felt, Star Trek Picard was really the costumes. The costume design was absolutely fantastic and very realistic for the future, where when I watch TNG and they show civilians in their everyday clothes, I'm just like, ugh, I just don't believe we're going to be wearing that in the future. But when I watch Star Trek Picard, I'm like, this looks like stuff that I think people would wear in the future.
Mm-hmm. Let me just say too, I want to agree with you. I think that there is something to this kind of question about spectacle, and I think it's something that you also see in Discovery a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Discovery often, you're going to talk a little bit about this with their fight scenes and things like this. I think that they get really focused on a lot of these kinds of action fight scenes, and some of the fight scenes, especially like the starship battles, are so cinematic. That they're amazingly beautiful. I think that the first couple of episodes of Discovery, focusing on the Battle of the Binary Stars, is some of the most beautiful Starfleet battles I've ever seen. It's so cinematic and beautiful, but it's sort of like you're overwhelmed just by the spectacle of it. And so I think that there has been a tendency to emphasize this quite a lot in a lot more contemporary Trek.
Yeah, and I think it happens a lot with big budget movies too, right? Like, I enjoy going to Marvel movies, but man, it's just when there's so much there, it's hard to like focus on what's important. And this is why I love TNG, and I think why a lot of early Star Trek, TOS, TNG, before, I guess pre-Discovery, I'm going to say, transfers the stage so well, is that it doesn't need a lot of spectacle. I think about two of my favorite productions I directed with Trek Theater were Measure of a Man and The Drumhead, right? Those two episodes are essentially courtroom dramas. You don't need, there's no, you don't need anything else. Just really good dialogue and really good actors, and really, it's just really strong. So to see like lots of spectacle, it's something that we need in today's society. I feel like that's something that audiences want and crave, is the spectacle. And now we have the technology and the money to really make big space battles. The idea with the fight scenes being very long, like I'm really into the ideas that action movies are a lot like musicals, where a song needs to be there to push the action forward or develop character. As in an action movie, the action should develop character or push the plot forward. And I feel in Star Trek Picard, a lot of the fight scenes go on pretty long, where I feel like this is a little much for me. But good choreography, good fight choreography. I loved, though, the fight scene with the two Romulan housekeepers with the, in the Chateau Picard, and suddenly they're like busting out. And I'm just like, and that was another thing. That's when I was like, I'd like to see a show about them. Like, who are they?
Yeah, they're great, huh?
Yeah, right? I love them. Give them a show. So anyways, yeah, and the tech was beautiful. I loved the tech. I loved the idea of, the screens that were sort of in the air, not physical screens, because there are lots of great shots of characters and their reactions coming, like looking at the character through the screen. And I think that was actually really well done, because we don't get this, that's not usually how, screens, there's usually a physical thing between, the camera. So lots of, you see lots of where they'll cut to like the screen and they'll cut to the reaction. There are lots of really lovely, little overdone, but they were lovely. So I'm going to say yes. And also the graphic violence was a little, whew, that Icheb's eye moment was really rough. But it's really interesting. I don't know if you know the story about the actor who originally played Icheb.
No,
Um,
tell us.
he he has since apologized, but when the sort of Kevin Spacey, Anthony Rapp, I guess sexual assault thing came out, he posted on Twitter just sort of some insensitive, kind of mean things about the situation, and people, Trek fans were furious, and have even like petitioned. I think it was a Comic-Con or a Trek Con petitioned to have him taken off the guest list. And so, yeah, you should look it up. I don't want to go into too much detail because it's pretty, it's pretty long story. But and then they didn't cast him, and then they gave him this graphic death scene. I was like, oh man, are they trying to like, trying to, say something to the actor, right? And I know
Wow.
they,
Yeah,
yeah.
I didn't
So
realize that. Wow.
I thought that was actually just a really interesting, the graphic violence. I was like, but it was an interesting, I guess, phenomenon that was going on with that, and how they didn't cast the original actor. It's interesting, but yeah, graphic violence was a little rough. And then here's my biggest, I guess, my biggest beef, is that Star Trek Picard really makes Star Trek a dystopian sci-fi show. It really lost what made Star Trek really special for me. People working together to solve problems, no conflicts within the crew to solve these problems, dealing with a moral and ethical quandary episode. And also the idea that in TNG and in other Star Treks too, we hear how people in the Federation have no need for money or possessions, and how poverty, hunger, and racism have all been eradicated. And there's that one of my favorite TNG episodes are the ones where they find the people from the 20th century frozen. And, Picard tells the rich guy, like, well, we don't have any need for possessions or money here. And you see the like drop in the guy's face, right? Like, I don't know, I just love that moment. And so now the Federation isn't like this. And there's even, Picard pays Rios to, there's talk of like payments. There's like a criminal underground that's dealing with, money and trading and things like that. The Federation is racist against Romulans. They, that whole situation. Classicism, we see classicism. So Rafi is a poor black woman now, right? And she's a drug addict. And I remember that moment where when I first watched it, I was like, oh wow, she's talking about Picard and all his wealth. And then she makes an offhand comment like, I could show you around my hovel, but that would just be, I can't remember exactly the word, embarrassing or upsetting or whatever. So I'm like, all right, so now there's classicism and there's classes here, which actually really bothered me, right? It was like, oh, it's, Star Trek now takes place in our world. And the other interesting thing is that, the the swears. That's another thing I want to talk about, the swears, which, part of me was sort of, I sometimes I watch TNG when something goes wrong. I'm like, oh, someone's got, I remember having moments where I'm like, someone's got to swear sometime. Like, I mean, things are not going right. Why is no one swearing? Because it's on TV, right? But now that there's swears in it, I was just like, it was weird. Except when Rios comes in and he hates the hologram. Like, then I laughed. But everywhere else, I was just like, Admiral, no, really? Also, I'm not saying that things like poverty, war, classism, racism shouldn't be written about, but lots of times it's easy drama to be made as a writer. I feel like that's why Star Trek was really well written, because they were able to talk about these issues in a way where the society of Star Trek, the world of Star Trek, didn't have these things, and it was always the other alien race that was dealing with it. I feel like they are kind of were taking some, I don't know, easy shortcuts, I think, writing wise. But yeah, like that's what Star Trek was what was wonderful about Star Trek for me is that it shows the potential in humanity when they got over that stuff, right? Like, we're all over our racism and classism and money and greed, and now we can explore space, and isn't this wonderful? And so that bothers me, and I understand that we live in a different the entertainment industry is differently, and so they need to think of ways to change things up, get more viewers. But for me, like Star Trek, you've heard me say this, Joseph, a lot. Star Trek's a rehearsal for the future. And really, like, by embodying, and this is, I know I've said this a lot to my Star Trek cast too, like, by embodying these characters and embodying this world and getting on stage and performing it, it is a way we get we get like a little bit closer to that world, right? And it sort of was, I mean, I think it was your first or second video you had as part of this, where you quoted Ursula Le Guin about, the radical imagination helping you imagine like new futures. And that's really what Star Trek for me is, this like, we're closer because we can imagine it. And I want to talk about one of my favorite theatrical theories here is Jill Dolan, who's a theatrical scholar, and her idea of the utopian performative. So, lots of things we ask about in the theater arts is, what is art without hope? Because I've watched lots of plays and movies where there is no hope, and it's kind of a rough viewing, right? So the utopian performative is this idea that a performance gives us this place to come together to share experiences, which audiences can glimpse a better world. And it's this idea that the audience is moved to a hopeful feeling by viewing the play. In this case, Star Trek, right? The idea is like, her idea is like, we're all sitting in this dark theater together as an audience, connecting physically, right? But I feel like it applies to film and TV as well, especially since we as Trekkers and Trekkies, and in contemporary times, we get on the internet and we talk about things, and we're still having reactions, and the films and the TV shows don't change. So we're all watching the same, text that we're analyzing, right? Dolan says, art is an arena in which an alternative world can be expressed through the communication of an alternative experience. And she talks about this isn't necessarily changing the world. I know when I was 20 years old in college, and I was like, my art's going to change the world. And that's, a great thought, right? But, I'm older now. I know that my art isn't necessarily going to change the world, but it gives us hope that the world can change. And that's Jill Dolan's The Utopian Performative. And right? So when I watch Star Trek alone and I talk about it with my friends, or I'm watching it with a group of people or with my theater company, we all sort of, there's this hope that comes from watching it. Like, oh, wouldn't it be great if we lived in a society like that? Ah, yes, and it's going back to the radical imagination, right? This, oh yes, wouldn't that be great? We're imagining, so we're just a little bit closer. Um, it's imagining and embodying a world so that we can work towards making it real. Um, and those are a couple of my that's my stuff. Those are a couple of my problems with it. So, um, and then I have this very last wonderful image. Actually, it was actually kind of my favorite episode.
Yeah, no, mine too.
Right.
Mine too.
And the funny thing is, though, I watched, finally it was like, oh yes, next week is the one that we get to see Jonathan Frakes. And but at the same time I almost was like, again, this is a pretty, most TV shows and movies have this sort of like break scene, like it's a break in the action, and that's what this was. But I also had moments where I'm like, is this really a necessary episode for the story? Because they show up to hide, but then they just leave again. I don't know, but I loved it, and I was I was surprised that Riker and Troy had a blonde child, but but it was a great little episode, and they're hooking me in because they're like, we're bringing back Riker, we're bringing back Troy, we're bringing back Data, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay. So that's the part that I really liked, and so I'm sort of felt kind of manipulated, like, but you got me. I bought CBS Access, CBS Access. I bought it, and I'll watch the next season of Picard. And I'm pretty excited about the animated show they've got.
Right, I've heard about that one too. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Well, my take on this is that this episode that you have here, right, Nepenthe, is probably one of the most important episodes in this series.
all right, good.
Yeah. Well, so these are. I'm gonna go back to our our sharing here, our faces. I think these are some compelling things, and like I said, I think I agree with you on some of it. But I think that I want to sort of push back on the idea that it's giving up on hope. And in fact, my whole argument, I think, is that Picard is really faithful to the Star Trek philosophy and the hope about the
Oh,
future, but in a
yeah,
very
yeah,
sort of different kind of way.
yeah, it is.
So let me see if I can share with you a little bit about how I think about this. And so I think that what's going on here is some really complicated kind of existentialism. Right, so I like to think about what's going on with Picard is the existentialism of Star Trek is sort of really being portrayed heavily here. And to address some of the things that you were talking about, I think you're right that this is not TNG Picard, and it's not the usual stories that we're used to with Picard. And so the part of the reason I think that is this, and you've sort of hinted at this, is that this is JL, as Rafi calls him, right? This is JL and the Federation after one of the most devastating wars in galactic history, the Dominion War, right? So, which is represented in Deep Space Nine, right? And so this is a period, Picard's grown up in this, and a lot of this is in the aftermath of that sort of existential threat to the Alpha Quadrant, right? Not just to the Federation, but to all of the peoples of the Alpha Quadrant, right? So this was a really sort of major event in Star Trek lore. So, right, so when we're talking about Picard, we're talking about him in that period, right? Not in the period of TNG. And also, right, the period of Picard is after one of the largest, biggest technological setbacks in human history. So we see the synth attack on Utopia Planatia on Mars because of the sort of Romulan infiltration of Starfleet. But if you think about this, this is one of the biggest sort of setbacks in terms of AI and synthetic life, right? There's the Android ban. There's all this kind of stuff that that humanity sort of has given up on and is sort of having to retool thinking about how it's going to do things technologically speaking. And if you think about like, right, the scene about the scenes that have to do with like the attack on Mars, you start to realize how reliant the Federation had become on androids and robotic life and all this kind of stuff. So after the attack on Mars by the synths, and the fact that the Federation had to pull back from that, you have to think that economically speaking, the Federation had to do a lot of rescaling and retooling of its society, economically speaking, and so forth. And so when we catch Picard at this time, not only is he dealing with the refugee crisis because of the destruction of Romulus, but all of this history up to this point has been one series after another of huge existential kinds of threats to the life of humanity, the sort of structure of society on Earth and throughout the Federation. So some really, really big stuff. And you know, to address the question about like, you know, are we retelling the same stories? I think that there's a scene in one of the episodes that's really telling. And that's when Dr. Girardi, portrayed by the actor Alison Pill, goes to visit Picard at his chateau. And she's looking through his collection of books, and she finds the Robot series by Isaac Asimov. And Picard walks in, and he says something like, "Ah, the classics." Right? He says, "You know, I never really got into science fiction." Right, and it's a kind of an odd sort of funny scene, right? Him talking about like how science fiction is not something that he's into. But I started to think about it, and I think that that scene is really forecasting something for us, is that this Picard series is not interested actually in telling us a story about robots or about AI or about android sentience, which I think, Chris, you're right, is that these stories have been told in a way in a variety of different ways, not only in TNG, but in TOS, right, and a lot of different places. I mean, this is a diehard kind of science fiction theme, but I think that scene with Girardi reading Asimov and Picard dismissing it is trying to tell us that this is something else is going on here with Picard. And so I think that this is part of the reason why Picard is different. I mean, he is, of course, older. And, you know, we've seen like the difficulty of Starfleet captains in retirement. I mean, this is, after all, the sort of whole thing going on in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, right, with Kirk dealing with his midlife crisis, right? And, you know, a lot of what's going on with The Wrath of Khan is about aging. And so I think that what's going on here too is Picard dealing not only with the frailty of his own body and his aging, but aging at a time in which so much stuff has just been one series of disasters after another. And so this is why I think that what's going on with Picard is what I call the tragic sense of Star Trek. Right, and I'll explain what that is in about a second. But a lot of people have been commenting on like Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard as having these really kind of dark moods and sort of dystopian. And you sort of hint at this, that it's sort of these shows perhaps maybe sort of give up on the idea of a hopeful kind of place because they're so kind of grim in their storytelling. And I think that I think it's right to sort of say that there's a different kind of mood here than was going on with TNG and with TOS even. And part of that, I mean, I think is in story explainable, right? Because of the Dominion War and with the Mars attack, but also just in terms of our contemporary American society, right? There's a lot of stuff that's gone bad in the past 20 years or so, and right, and I think that when Discovery came on board in 2017, there were some of the showrunners, and in fact, Jason Isaac too, sort of here portraying Captain Lorca, right? They were sort of suggesting that Star Trek was a kind of a reaction to political developments in the UK with Brexit and with the election of Trump in the United States, right? That these were sort of these kinds of feelings people were having, like, what world have we suddenly enveloped, right? Where are we living, right? And Discovery takes this on really sort of head on, right? Is that the intersection between the mirror universe and the regular timeline is blurred. And so we're not living in the same world anymore. And so many people have expressed that, since 2016, with all this kind of stuff around the world, that it seems like we've grown up in a whole different world that we didn't know about all of a sudden. So I think that contemporary Trek is responding in some sense to different kind of cultural moods. But I think that what it's trying to do is to offer guidance to how to navigate this kind of sense of things. But it's grounded, I think, ultimately in Trek philosophy, that it hasn't given up the core values that I want to talk about. And I call this the tragic sense because I think it's responding to something that comes out with Rios. Right. So you see here Rios portrayed in the ship La Serena reading a book. And the book is The Tragic Sense of Life by the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a way, but I think it's really significant that there's so much fixation on this book, and particularly in books in Picard, right? So one of the things I found really interesting is that books and titles keep popping up in various ways, and they're old style books, right? They're not, people aren't reading pads. They're reading these old, page turner kinds of things, which is like the ancient technology, which you rarely saw that in TOS, TNG, or any of the, I mean, people were reading pads when they were reading anything, but Picard really focuses on paper books. And so I want to talk about Unamuno in just a second, but I think that what the contemporary Trek is trying to do is to respond to this kind of sense of loss that's really pervasive in at least the United States. And so just to hint at this, right? A Pew Research survey that was done in December 2018, published in 2019, says these kinds of gloomy feelings that a lot of Americans have. For instance, like 73% of Americans think that income inequality will continue to grow between now and 2050, right? And so that things are going to just continue getting worse. Almost 70% of Americans are concerned about climate change effects. And, more than half of us think that things are going to continue to be politically polarized for the next 30 years. So there's little kind of sense that things are going to start to get better anytime soon. In fact, that things are just going to keep getting worse. Our political problems are just going to continue getting worse and worse over the next, few decades. In a very similar kind of CBS News poll that came out in January 2019, 65% of Americans thought that the U.S. is on the wrong track. And when they were sort of pushed to sort of explain what this means, 64% of them said that it's because of our government. And then 24%, right, so almost 25% said that it's because of our values, that something is wrong with our values in the country. And the survey didn't ask them to explain, what that meant, but it was just this kind of sense that there's something wrong, culturally speaking, with our values. 56% of Americans in that survey think that our values are changing in ways that they don't like. So I think that what we're seeing going on a lot in the United States is this kind of sense of, as you've mentioned, apocalypse or doom, or definitely a sense of kind of loss, that we're losing something and that we're going to continue losing something. And we're scared of that kind of sense of loss. And so I think that that's in some sense the mood that Trek is trying to respond to. And in my argument, I think that they're not sort of giving in to this kind of sense of loss, but they're trying to show us how to navigate that. And the way that I sort of came to this kind of conclusion is by something I found on Twitter, right? So this is talking about Unamuno, right? People were really fascinated by all of the different kinds of books that are being seen on the show. And someone screenshotted Rios reading The Tragic Sense of Life. And the page at which comes up on the screen, I think, is really interesting in this book. And so Miguel de Unamuno was a Spanish existential philosopher, lived from 1864 to 1936. And The Tragic Sense of Life was one of his most famous books, translated into English much later on in the 20th century, but written in about 1912. And what Unamuno tries to do there, he's an existentialist. He's responding to the kinds of things that sort of come out with Soren Kierkegaard and this kind of notion that, life is full of dread and suffering and all this. And the passage that Rios is reading at this time it goes something like this. Suffering is the path of consciousness. And by it, living beings arrive at the possession of self-consciousness. For to possess consciousness of oneself, to possess personality, is to know oneself and to feel oneself distinct from other beings. And this feeling of distinction is only reached through an act of collision, through suffering more or less severe, through a sense of one's own limits, right? And so for Unamuno, there's this kind of sense that in order to know who we are as individuals, but also just in general as human beings, we have to collide with one another. We have to sort of push ourselves to see what our boundaries are with one another. And I think that you see this going on almost with all of the characters in Star Trek Picard. There's an overwhelming sense of this kind of loss and suffering in so many of them. Rafi, right after the synth attack on Mars, loses her career, and as a result loses her son because of her dedication to Starfleet. Picard loses his career and goes shuffling off for the next 15 years to La Barre, France, right? Obviously miserable. But we also see this with Riker and Troy. They move to that planet because they have a son with a disease that's very severe and needs a certain kind of environment. They can't get treatment for him because of the synth attack, right, and the way the Federation has responded to it. So they're feeling a great sense of loss. They're suffering. Rios, right, lost his captain, he lost his ship, he lost his career. And so all of these characters are in the, as Picard says, have baggage. And the baggage is of a sense of profound loss that has disconnected them from their typical moorings, and they're trying to find a way forward. And so I think the key to Picard is this idea of people trying to figure out who they are and what their personality is in the middle of all this kind of suffering as a result of profound personal and social loss. And I think that's tapping into the mood of what's going on with contemporary society. And so I think that the way that Picard is true to the sort of Star Trek philosophy that I've talked about in other videos before is that I think on the one hand that it's true to the core value, I think, of cooperation, which you sort of hinted at, Chris, right? In some other videos, I've talked about that one of the most important scenes that's almost in all this different Star Trek series, going back to TOS, even to the Cage episode, right, is the scene of the conference room where you have everyone sitting around together trying to figure out how they're going to work together to address a common problem with one another. And I think that, as I've said before, this is a really kind of important scene because it emphasizes that for Star Trek, the idea of democratic deliberation and these professionals coming together to share their little bits of knowledge and insight with one another to come up with a solution that none of them could have come up with alone. I think that's a really important kind of vision of the future for Star Trek, and it's something that it wants to kind of preserve, right? This idea of solidarity and cooperation together. And I think that you do see this in, of all places, the Riker household in the episode Nepenthe. Right, they all have dinner together, right? They are chowing down on Riker's pizza. And what are they doing? They're trying to draw up a plan, in fact, to proceed to get Soji back to the synth planet so she can figure out who she is, right? Because of that sense of loss for her. And they're trying to figure out, like, how are we going to find out where this world is? How are we going to do this all? And in fact, I think Troy said at some point, said, imagine our dinner table as the conference room on the Enterprise. Boom, that's what they're doing, right? And so I think that what they try to do with this episode is they try to ground it in this kind of glimpse of what Star Trek is, which is partly a meditation on the need to work together through cooperation. And the Nepenthe, I think that episode really does that well. It emphasizes the notion of the suffering, but that the suffering is something that we can all work through together, and that we need each other to be able to solve. And so finally, this leads me to sort of my last thought about this, is that what you see Picard doing over and over and over again in the show is saying something like this, right? There are these lines where he says, you know, here the quote is, "Fear is the great destroyer." At other places, he says, "Fear is an incompetent teacher." I think that what's going on with Picard is he's trying to guide us through these periods of dystopia and trying to say, look, things look pretty bad and it's not a good place that we're at, but we don't give up on our values and our principles. We have to, in some sense, work together. In fact, he tells Soji in the part two, the very final episode, I think he tells her something. That's why we're here, to save each other. And the way that we save each other, he says, is with openness, with optimism, a spirit of curiosity. And he's talking about the Romulans. All they have is secrecy and fear, right? So when Soji is threatening to call the Synthetic Federation and bring all hell down on the organic world, he says, "Look, you know, you have a choice, and you can give in to the fear that is born by secrecy from the Romulans, or you can trust us." Because, right, we didn't destroy you. We have the power to have killed you, but we wanted you to make that choice because we believe that you have the ability to make a choice about how you want to move forward. So, right, go ahead and call the synths if you think that that's right, but recognize that there are these kinds of values that we in the Federation hold on to that make us different even from the Romulans, right? All organics are not the same. And what I think is going on here is this, right, to put this in the fancy kind of academic way, is that, right, a lot of folks who study utopia and dystopian thought talk about, right, the difference between a utopia of escape and what they might call blueprint utopias. The blueprint utopia idea is the idea that what utopia represents is a place out there that's a vision of how we want to get to. And it's a vision of the perfect world. And we have to sort of then figure out how to take the steps to get to that world out there. The idea of the utopia of escape harkens back to some of the very earliest kinds of utopian literature. This is the stuff that you find, for instance, in like Genesis, right, in the Old Testament, or some of the ancient Greek um, myths about perfect worlds, Arcadia, right. And so the utopia of escape is not a full sort of vision of a world in which we can get to, but it's sort of these glimmers and snippets of a world in which there is no pain, no suffering, lots of food. We're going to be living in all these great places, right? The ancient Greek myth of Arcadia is this kind of, you know, this place in which everything is going to be taken care of, and we're not going to suffer, and we're not going to be in pain, right? And so I think that what's often called about here is this utopia of escape. It's a place to sort of values that get us out of where we are at. And I think that what's going on with Picard is that it's not a blueprint utopia in the ways that maybe earlier Trek might have been, of like, here's the Federation, here's Starfleet, right? As you were saying, here's the place to hope for. Instead, I think it's hopeful because it says that in order to get out of the current place that we're in, which is full of so much pain and suffering and so far, like, we need to hearken to these values and these kinds of things that seem to be disappearing, and let's hold on to them and go forward with them, because those are the things that are going to save us. And I think that this is significant too, is that, right, I talked about this ancient Greek myth of Arcadia, which is the utopia of escape for the ancient Greeks, the place of pleasure and ultimate food. I mean, the final two episodes in Picard, right, the titles of those episodes are In Arcadia Est Ego, right? So, right, Arcadia is directly referenced in the title of those two episodes, in which Picard tries to show Soji that there's a different kind of way of which to understand all organics, that the Federation, at least, even though it sort of seems kind of grim right now, is ultimately defined by its openness and optimism. And so he's also speaking, I think, to the Federation, is that, look, we don't have to give in to secrecy and to fear. We don't have to give in to intolerance of others. We don't have to live that way. And if we hold on to those core Federation values will be able to move on to a better place. And so that's why I think that Picard is a utopian show, and it's really grounded in Trek, in ways that are I think are deep. Not a total sort of rejection of earlier kinds of stuff. You don't see it as explicitly, but I think that we're dealing with a different kind of utopia in Picard than in earlier kinds of shows. The one thing I wanted to say that we didn't get a chance to mention and to talk about, right, is that one thing I didn't like, and we're talking about characterization, is I didn't like the whole Seven of Nine story.
No, actually, no, I didn't like Seven of Nine's story either. Um, she's not, yeah, she's different too. Like when I also really love Voyager. That's my other favorite one is Voyager and TNG. And Seven of Nine was, she was sort of the Spock of Voyager, right? Logical and, she was the person who sits outside of humanity and like asks about what does it mean to be human. And yeah, it's just kind of a disappointment that she now loves to run around shooting up people. I don't
Yeah,
know.
and I mean, what's interesting about this is that I mean, like you were saying, I didn't understand like how she got to where she was.
Yeah.
Obviously, lots of things have changed, and maybe that's, I mean, maybe there's another like Star Trek, Seven of Nine,
Star
right? The
Trek
whole thing,
Seven of Nine.
right? I mean, I would love that show. Like, I'd like to
I'd
see
love that show
like
absolutely too. Yeah.
yeah, like what drove her to the Fenris Rangers, and why is she like, I can understand like a little bit, there's some sort of glimmers here about why she's like so revenge, she's like the vengeful angel now, right, and all this kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
But it just, some of it, like you were saying, the expectations or the believability of that story didn't make sense to me, is because so Voyager gets back, and then what happened to everyone that Seven feels like so abandoned? I mean, is it realistic that Janeway would have just like dropped her like that? I mean, where is Janeway in all of this kind of story? I mean,
Right.
I
Yeah.
don't need a Janeway kind of appearance, but I can't believe that Janeway would have just let Seven go like that.
Yeah. Right.
And the other thing is like, what about Chakotay? Like, they were supposed to be together. Like, what happened there,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Just some
I don't
kind of
know.
line where like, I dumped Chakotay, right, or something like that. Like, so it was like these weird kinds of gaps in that storyline that just sort of felt
Yeah.
weird to sort of, and so that felt like a great fan service. I love to see Jerry Ryan, right, and in this role, but it was weird and not entirely believable to me. And similarly with like the data story, right, about
Yeah.
him choosing Picard, is just like, I don't think he would have chosen
Yeah.
Picard
No, he
to
wouldn't
be
have.
at his deathbed.
I feel like there's when I watch this, I'm like there are, you know, I feel like I feel like they should have just done a not TNG Star Trek again, right? Like I would have liked to have seen another, like if they would have just cut all the old Star Trek out of it and had like new characters and stuff. I feel like that's sort of, I guess, where I feel like I also felt there's just like too many characters, right? I'm just like, whoa, 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 you know. I feel like on old Star Trek, having a lot of characters makes sense because, right, it's episodic. So we're gonna have a Riker episode, we're gonna have a Data episode, we're gonna have a Geordi episode, and so we get to learn a lot about these characters throughout the whole season. And I feel like I just learned, just not enough about the new characters, and then had so many questions about the old characters, that really left me like wanting more. Like I feel like this isn't the Seven of Nine story I want to see. I want to see that Seven of Nine story, right? But I loved the character of Rios. I thought his ship was awesome, and and again, I was like, he's got a really interesting story. Why not, let's see that story. I felt like every story I was being presented with like lots of really good stories that I wanted more of, but never, but then got a story that was, a lot of little bits of things, I guess. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense to me too. I mean, I think that Rios was really important. Like I sort of said, I think, I mean, part of this is perhaps maybe, I think my argument is sort of about Star Trek is maybe based, I think maybe on the influence of the showrunner Michael Chabon, who wrote some of the episodes too. But right, the sort of really thoughtful writers brought on to sort of be the one to tie this all together. And I think that that's partly why there's so much emphasis on books in this series, and the kind of philosophical themes that are going on, and the particular works that were chosen to be represented in all of this. And I think that also, right, Michael Chabon he was responsible for one of the most one of my favorite short treks, right, that sort of came out during the Discovery season, where you sort of see the Discovery 1,000 years into the future that's been abandoned. And it's a really sort of beautiful short trek if people haven't had a chance to see that one. But I think that part seems to be that this was very similar to what's going on in Discovery, is that there's so many characters introduced that it's really hard to get a sense of. I still don't know the names of, like, half the bridge crew on the
Yeah,
Discovery.
me either. I don't.
So, I don't, it's hard for me to sort of know who everyone is. And I think a lot of fans were complaining about this, is that there's so many characters. And then in season 2, they bring in, right, Anson Mount to do
Oh yeah.
Pike, which was great.
Yeah, I know. I loved Anson Mount as Pike. It was
Yeah, I think the Pike stuff. I mean, I've always had a
yeah.
fondness for the Pike character, and all the rumors that they're trying to develop maybe now a
I
Pike
know a Pike. Well, I
vehicle.
watched that.
That's exciting to me,
Yeah.
and I kind of like. So I think that part of what was going on is that they wanted to do something new with Trek and introduce all new characters, and they did that with Discovery. And then it wasn't getting the kind of fan traction that
Yeah.
they wanted. So they
Absolutely.
bring in Pike, and they saw, like, the big buzz that's created there, and they're thinking, well, what do we do with this? Do we go with another Section 31 show, which I haven't heard anything
Oh,
about?
I've heard they're supposed to, yeah, I kind of heard that maybe they might have one. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be okay. I mean, I love Michelle Yeoh too as
Yeah, I
an
do too.
actor,
Yeah.
but I'd be less interested in seeing that than a really good Picard or a really good Pike. And this is kind of the thing, is that I feel bad saying this, but I think that Star Trek really does well when it does concentrate on, like, these captain figures, or these.
Yeah, it does.
And so I think that the experiment that they tried to do with Discovery, by focusing not on a captain but on Michael Burnham, I mean, I love that character too in a lot of ways, but I think that they're trying to sort of figure out, and you've talked about this in other kinds of ways, how to make money.
Yes, it's a lot about how to make money.
Yeah, and I think that maybe what they decided to do with Picard is they said, oh, we need a vehicle to do some fan service, and to draw in folks who are saying that Discovery is not real Trek. How do we do that? Well, let's bring in a beloved captain, and do some stories with this, and that way we satisfy that kind of desire. And in one way, you can sort of see that it's really crass commercialism going on with Picard. But you know, in my couple of viewings of this season, I've come to this conclusion that I shared with you, that I think that there's something much deeper going on with Picard, in the way that it's trying to offer hope, but it's not trying to
Yeah.
offer hope in the ways that the old Treks did. And that's partly because we live in a different time, in a different world, and I
Yeah.
think we need to talk about utopia and dystopia in a different kind of way than they might have in Cold War era, or even right at that moment of TNG, where, right, the Cold War is coming to an end. I think we need new kind of language to think
Right.
about hope, and I think that that's what Picard is trying to do, at least, is to try to give us a different way of
Yeah.
thinking about that. But uh, it's still, I mean, Discovery and Picard still, kind of grimdark,
Yeah,
and
they are grim dark.
it's hard to sort of wade through that a lot to see the hope sometimes.
Right.
But I think it's there, and it's there in these kinds of Easter egg ways. And so I'm not sure if that's the best way
Yeah,
to
you're
do
right. It
that.
is. You're absolutely right. It is an Easter egg ways. Right. And the other thing, Trek is they're trying to explore what Trek is now too. Right.
Yeah,
It's like what it can, and I know this, and I've said it over and over to my friends. Like, Trek can never be TOS. We can never have a TOS again. We can never have a TNG again. Not just out of, like, subject matter, but just that type of uh, TV show, that type of product doesn't work well with audiences anymore, right? Audiences want long serials, right? Like a long movie. I'm trying to think, like, was Lost was sort of one of the first TV shows that did that. Like, I think since then, Game of Thrones, like, that has been how we consume our media different, right? We sit on Netflix and we binge watch now. So watching the entire season of Picard, and I couldn't do it, but like you could sit down and watch the whole season of Picard. It's like a really long movie, and so it needs, the way we make media and the way we consume media are all different. You know, the way we consume media is different now, so the way we make media has to be different. So you know, our needs are different as audience members. So they're also, I think they're also trying to figure out how can we fit Trek into this new, you know, model.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. This is a sort of a reflection of like what to how do we make or rethink Trek in this kind of way, which is
Yeah,
kind of cool in a
it
way.
is
And you
kind of
think
cool.
about
Yeah,
like, I mean, this is like, you know, like the reigning queen of science fiction franchises, right? We're going on a 50 plus years of storyline for
yeah,
this universe. That's quite fantastic, and we continually are rethinking how to connect this with other stories and how to do, right, as you're pointing out, the storytelling, right? How do we do this well? I mean, I think DS9 was was also one of the shows to start doing this kind of serialized format, especially when it got to the Dominion War
yeah. They
ways.
started it. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think that and there you start to get some very grim kinds of storylines as well. But it's not quite as grim dark as Picard or Discovery
yeah,
is. But I mean, for me, DS9 is one of my favorite series, I think, after TOS for me, partly because I like the tone. And I recognize that it's a kind of a controversial series, but partly is because it rejected the Roddenberry view that we can't show conflict
yeah. It
between
did.
a lot of folks, right, and all this kind of stuff. And I think that that Roddenberry philosophy still was part of TNG. But I was glad to see it go with DS9, and I'm glad to see it go in things like Discovery and Picard, because like I think you're right. You would never have seen a character like Rafi if Roddenberry was around.
Yeah, right.
Right, because
Yeah,
she's like, you know, poor, a drug addict, right, and all this kind of stuff. That would never have flown for Roddenberry because he wanted, as you were saying, to you know, show a different kind of future for
yeah.
us.
I kind of wish how they would have had the drug addict, you know, not be a black woman. You know, I sort of was just like, oh, we really, oh, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something that that Star Trek does well sometimes, and others not so well. Is like it's kind of questions about race and the way that it might sort of overlay images on
mm-hmm.
race. Uh, yeah, this is a whole different other sort of discussion,
Yeah,
right, to
right.
get
Yeah,
into, but
it's like what I always say in theater. I'm like, race and gender always read on stage. So, you know, there's, you know, and we have colorblind casting in the theater, and we have my philosophy, which is race and gender always read on stage. So you need to be careful about, you know, who you're casting.
right.
Although
Well,
also, oh, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say to you all's credit, like what Trek Theater has done, especially like in your sort of last sort of season, you did one of my favorite episodes from TOS, right, Space Seed. But
Oh yeah,
in thinking about how to sort of really change up the ways in which you think about race and gender and all this, you cast Khan as a with an actor who's a black woman, right, and played it out that way, right, on stage. And so I thought that was really fascinating, how you sort of really tweaked this kind of storyline about what do we mean by the kind of superior superhuman, right?
yeah,
But
right. But you know what? She wasn't originally Khan. Our
ah,
Who was Khan? Our Khan couldn't do it. Something happened. I can't remember, but uh, Kara is her name. The actress's name came in audition and said, "I only want a small part," but she gave a really good audition. And so I didn't direct that show. Another person directed it, and I said, uh, "Yeah, I think that Kara would do a great job, but you know, you're putting the only black actor in the troupe as the villain, right?" And I'm like, that can go. I mean, mm, that's tough. You can also say like, oh well, yeah, here we have the superhuman person being represented by a black woman, right, instead of a white man. But then there's also the issue of, I've seen so many, all white casts that cast a black guy as the villain, and I'm just like, that's just don't.
yeah, well, good point, right? And here,
Yeah,
and as you point out here, like the character Raffi, right, is um, a black woman who is a drug addict living out in a trailer somewhere in the
Mm-hmm.
desert, right? What is the sort of what's that telegraphing out? So I think that that's a really good question to ask, and something perhaps that we can talk about on a different episode. But
I did like the actor though. I
yes,
I gotta give them credit because they had older women playing leading characters, right? Like that's great. Giving parts to older women, I'm all about.
yeah, no, I think Rafi is a great character. I mean, a lot of the characters I've really liked. I mean, I like Rios. Girardi, I'm not a big fan
Yeah,
of that character necessarily, but she does her function and all this. But I think
yeah,
that the acting was really done well throughout all of this, and I think that I can watch it again. But it's sort of like I think this is what I've told friends: to enjoy Picard, you have to sort of think about it like a bottle of Chateau Picard. You have to sit and sip it
yeah,
and meditate on it. It's not something that you can do shots with. And so if you're looking for something like that, then probably not, because it will put you to sleep.
right. Well, I should rewatch it now. You've given me a new sort of a new way to look at it. Um,
And I just say I want to appreciate you as well to think about this. I mean, it's made me sort of think more carefully about the ways in which utopia is represented in Trek, and the developing ways in which
mhm.
utopia is represented in Trek. I think you're absolutely right that this is totally different, and people going into it need to sort of do that. And so
Yeah,
I think that it's for someone who like me, who is a lifelong Trekker, I don't know exactly, but whoever who's able to sort of appreciate the ways in which that goes on. Picard is something that's enjoyable. But I think that for fans who are not Star Trek fans, who are trying to get into Picard from the get-go, I'm not sure if it's really for them.
yeah. I don't know. Well, I don't know who would watch Star Trek Picard without having watched the whole thing, though,
Right.
right?
Well, you're like, who would watch it at all? Right. No, I agree. I agree. Good. Well, thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate your always working with you, and I appreciate your
Yeah,
thoughts about this.
ditto. Thank you, Joseph.
So, any last minute thoughts on Picard that you want to share with us?
I'm actually, I'm hopeful for the end, right? Like I'll keep watching it because I want to know how it ends.
Right.
They have a second season. They've already decided it, and I don't really know if they've started writing it or not. But I'm really curious how our current, you know, situation with the COVID-19 pandemic is going to affect the next season and the seasons following, or even any other Trek that's coming out. How that's going to change, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I know they're changing showrunners too for season 2, so I don't know if Michael Chabon is going to be involved in anymore. But yeah, we might be waiting a while before we can
Yeah,
enjoy any
right.
of
Yeah,
our really good science fiction. So maybe there'll be a lot of time to reflect on these themes.
yeah, right. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris. I appreciate you coming out and chatting with us. And
Thanks.
those of you who are watching, if you have any thoughts that you'd like to share, we'd like to hear your comments and thoughts. You can leave some comments down below, or you can reach us at the Anarres Project. That's Anarres Project. Our handle is at Anarres, Anarres Project, all one word. And that's at Anarres Project on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, or you can reach us at anarresproject.org, which is our website. Let us know what you think, and hopefully we can continue the conversation. But thanks, Chris. Good luck to you down there in Roseburg, and hopefully
Thank
we'll be
you.
able to see each other soon.
Yep.
All right. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks, you all.